Drash, where the water of life meets the tree of life. This is our very first episode, and I'm so delighted that you are here. This is a podcast that is about everything whiskey and Jewish. You'll be meeting Jewish professionals who have a love of whiskey, and you'll be meeting whiskey professionals who are Jewish. And what they share in common is not only an interest in whiskey, but wonderful stories. Stories that will give us windows into ideas and culture and history and philosophy and beliefs, all through the lens of whiskey, but then the stories that come out of sharing a dram together to see where they take us. So I'm delighted for this very first episode to be welcoming Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. Rabbi Brad Hirschfield has a very extensive bio, and I'm not going to do justice to it in this brief introduction, so I'm going to be posting a link to that in the notes for this episode. But let me just tell you a little bit about him. He is the president of CLAL, which is a Jewish think tank looking at ways to make Judaism and all things Jewish a public good in the larger world. He is a regular contributor in print media, on blogs, on TV, cable, all kinds of shows. He has been interviewed across the spectrum. He's the author of a book called You Don't Have to Be Wrong for Me to Be Right. It's a wonderful book. I've read it and I highly recommend it. And he's passionate about interfaith work and has spoken at many, many different kinds of gatherings in many different kinds of settings, including the Aspen Institute and the Parliament of World Religion. So with no further ado, it is my pleasure to welcome Rabbi Brad Hirschfield. So welcome, Brad, to A Dram A Drash. It is really wonderful to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with you. I love the name, I love the concept, and I love any time I get to talk and learn from you, so it's all good.
And the feeling is mutual, likewise. So let's jump right in. Let's learn a little bit about what dram you have brought and tell us why you like it.
I have, and it's right front and center on your table, I see, is Dalwhinnie. And the truth of the matter is, it's all about my dad, which I know sounds kind of corny and cheesy and all that kind of stuff, and he's gone almost 10 years now. But my father was a Scotch drinker, and this was long before certainly Americans were drinking single malt whiskey. I'm not sure that Americans knew what single malt whiskey was when I was a little kid. But one of the rituals, right? Rituals come in all kinds of forms and ways. Sometimes they're overtly religious, sometimes they're not, but they're still rituals, was that my father would arrive home every day pretty darn close to 6 o'clock. He and my uncle owned their own business, and they were done at 5, and they got in their car and they drove home. They drove together. He'd get home about 6 o'clock, and he and my mother would sit and have a cocktail together every evening at 6 o'clock, and the kids would gather there also, and everyone would talk about their day. And my father, every day, when he came home, except for Friday night, Shabbat, he didn't have a cocktail because he came home and he went to Kabbalat Shabbat. He went to services, and then he had wine with dinner. So there was no cocktail on Friday. And when he went out, still a Scotch drinker, but he drank Rob Roy's. But at home, it was simple Scotch on the rocks with water. And as my own explorations with drinking, that sounds much worse than it actually is meant to come out. Among the things I came to appreciate was Scotch. And I love Dalwhinnie because my father liked gentler Scotches. He didn't like anything too strong or smoky or peaty. And as I tasted various single malts, because that became a whole thing, and I actually think there's a whole sociology of why traditionally observant Jews came to attach themselves to single malt whiskey. Maybe we can talk about that later if you want. This kind of is where I landed. And it's definitely not the only thing in the liquor cabinet, but it's the thing I find over the last, 20, 25 years that I return to, and that toward the end of my life, or end of his life, I should say, my father would say, I don't know, I'm not really a single malt person, but that I could get used to. And so that's what it is. It's easy to drink. It's gentle. It has some flavor. So I suppose in some ways it's also a metaphor for the fact that at the end of the day, I think more things are enjoyable than we necessarily imagine, done gently than not. And I know we live in a culture that celebrates ferocity, and I believe in deep commitment and all that stuff. But somehow in the midst of figuring out what our deep commitments are, we've lost a certain gentleness in how we do everything, from how we drink to how we do politics to how we do religion. And so in some weird way, and this may be pushing too far along this thread, but actually I do think that's part of the reason that I like this rather gentle but flavorful whiskey.
It's a great metaphor. And I think actually we can possibly extend some of the metaphoric value of this a little further, because the other thing that strikes me about Dalwhinnie is, as opposed to many other whiskeys, where if you get a 15-year-old whiskey, that's already moving up the line a little bit, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I love Glenmorangie. Their kind of standard, the foundational whiskey is 10, right? And then it moves up from there. But Dalwhinnie starts at 15. And it's a testament, I think, to, first of all, its legacy, its history. It has a particular way for a very long time that it's made this whiskey. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's something that you have to wait for. 15 years, you have to be patient. It takes its time to kind of get to that mellow place. And I think that the other thing about it is, as you said, Americans have not been drinking single malt whiskey for all that long in the big picture. I mean, it really wasn't really a thing. And even the distilleries were putting out until the 1990s, and it's become a thing. But until then, a lot of what Dalwhinnie was making was going into blends. I actually, when I was reading up a little bit about its history, and in the early 1900s, for about 14, 15 years, it was actually bought by American distillers, which disturbed the Scots to no end. But they were putting it into making the kinds of blends that they thought would be appreciated in the American market. Then Prohibition came along, and they had to sell the company because they couldn't do business anymore.
I love that. And I think you're right. And probably at heart, in a lot of ways, I am. I mean, I love new stuff. And I love experimentation, but I am fundamentally a very traditional, even conservative kind of person. And so I think that balance probably makes sense. I never thought of it that way. But yeah, a little extra patience rarely hurt. Not never hurt, because sometimes you do have to push and you do have to break through. And it's time for things, even if they're a little uncomfortable or a little too dark or a little bit complex for people. I get that. But on balance, I'll take the extra 3 years against the standard expression of 12.
Right. So I'm going to take my dram here. I know you have one to the ready.
I do indeed.
And so let's actually see what we think Dalwhinnie tastes like. I know you enjoy it, but it's kind of a different exercise to actually see if we can identify what it is we're tasting or what we think that we're smelling. So, it's funny, when I read tasting notes, I can read 6 different websites and see how other people describe whiskey, and none of them are the same.
Right.
So there's no wrong answers here, really. It's,
for sure.
We learn how to taste, but there's also what do we pick up. So if you want to start with a nosing, and I don't know what comes through to you as you smell that.
I mean, there is a kind of sweetness, a kind of floweriness, and I feel so pretentious when I use any of these words, and I'm like, who are you kidding? Just drink it and enjoy it. But I know there's a whole world of people who are far more sophisticated than I'm. Like, no, there are really words there. And I know how much of my life and other parts of my life are filled with arcana that are absurd to most people, but I like them, right? And I always tell people, Jews have a way of fighting about things that even most Jews don't think of are things. So the fact that people do with whiskey should be no different. But yeah, there's a sweetness, there's a floweriness, there is a distinctive scotchiness. Like, you would never smell this and go, oh, I wonder, is that Irish whiskey? Or I wonder, is that bourbon? You wouldn't. It's definitely Scotch.
Right.
But it's got a velvety smell to it. So.
Right. That malted, toasty grain sort of smell coming through. And yeah, I also get the floral. And actually, one of the smells that I got in terms of sometimes when we're trying to say what kind of fruit are there fruity tones there, is I got a hit of pear, maybe a little apple too, but kind of pears in there. And and that floral note, I'm maybe over picturing in my mind where Dalwhinnie is, but I get a little heather.
Uh-huh.
I think there's, and And there may be a reason to that, because one of the things that I actually had forgotten about Dalwhinnie is it is very smooth. It is very florally. It describes itself as a Highland whiskey. It's actually in the Speyside region. And it's interesting, the Scotch Whisky Association allows whiskies made in that region, they can choose whether to call themselves Speyside or Highland. I didn't actually realize they sort of are the same thing, and different whiskey companies choose different things. So Aberlour, Macallan, they use Highland, others use Speyside. So this describes itself as a Highland whiskey on its label, but it actually is lightly peated. It's not peat-free.
Wow. All right. See, I knew I'd learned stuff today.
Yeah, it's so lightly peated. I don't really pick it up in the nose at all, except when I say those heather notes. What makes peat from the Highland area different from peat in Islay is what died to make the peat,
right.
What decomposed. And it's very different. So, those really strong flavors you get on Islay that talking about pretentious descriptions, when people describe things that taste like burnt tires,
right.
and I go, why would you want to
drink
when
did
that?
You ever taste a burnt tire?
But I understand it's like that pungent smokiness that they're getting at, or that iodine, or the seaweed sea air. So that's what I associate with those Islay peaties. But this is something of a whole different order. Sure. So I'm going to take a taste. I'm going to sure l'chaim.
It's good. It's easy to drink. I guess that's also part of it. I don't want to be challenged by a whiskey. I want a whiskey that kind of embraces me as much as I embrace it. And this does that. And if it's okay to say, that was kind of true with my dad, too. I remember that I was in high school, and I was home, and my dad came home, and I got up as he came in the door, and we gave each other a kiss hello. And the friend was looking at me going, has he been away for a while? And I'm like, no. And it was really one of the first times, probably 14, 15 years old, that I realized that wasn't typical. Right? I come from a family. People hug and kiss, including men who hug and kiss each other, women who hug and kiss each other. And to that point in my life, I don't think I ever realized that wasn't so typical. So even there, like my dad, and it's not that we didn't fight, didn't have issues, because that's, I'm not going to, it's not the Brady Bunch. It's just there was a lot of embrace. And so, I guess I want a whiskey that embraces me as much as I embrace it. And this does.
Well, this certainly is. Yes, it's such a smooth drinking whiskey. It wins awards over and over again. As I said, even though it has this long history, we go from dram to drush. And because this is with you, Brad Hirschfield, we're already drushing. We're drushing on the whiskey, and there's so much more we could do with that. But I know that you started to tell us a little bit about your father and that being your way into Scotch whiskey. And that story goes back a little further.
Because it turns out that my mother's family came to the U.S. by way of Scotland. And I still have relatives in Scotland, although I think the three women who are my generation, none of them are there anymore. I'm pretty sure one goes back and forth more, but they ended up making lives in England, in France, and in Canada. The ones were but my mother's cousins, if you went to Glasgow and asked to meet Ivor Plotnikoff, that's my mom's cousin. And it turns out that my mother's maternal grandmother, right, her mom's mom, was sent to Scotland to follow her older brother, which was all part of her parents' design to get her away from Sam Plotkin, who was her suitor at the time. He had 3 strikes against him. And it wasn't that he wasn't gainfully employed. He actually came from a solidly upper middle class family. They had money. In fact, his journey to the States was because he thought he could grow the business better. They made coaches and cabinets. And when he applied, he wanted to expand the business into the city of Minsk, from the district of Minsk. Went to the city. His father said, yeah, by all means, if they'll give us a permit, we can do it. And of course, he was told, you're a Jew. You work in the provinces. No one's letting you into this guild. He goes home to his father and he says, look, we have the money, we have the skill, we have the will. If it won't be here, it'll be in the New World. I'm going to America. But first, I'm going to marry Sarah Plotnikoff. Well, so Sarah's parents, who was the last picture, that was the first and only picture I had growing up of a traditionally observant Jew in my family. You have to literally go back to my great-great-grandparents to get someone who looks like, Tevye the milkman. That just wasn't my upbringing. And he said, I want to marry her. Well, you can't. A, you want to go to America. We can't have that. B, you're younger than her. We can't have that. C, you're not particularly religious, and we can't have that. So my great-grandmother's father sends Sarah off to be with her older brother, who's already gone to Scotland, and is making his living in a time-honored way. He was a professional wrestler. And this is what he did. Yeah, Jake Packenoff, the wrestling Jew. And we have pictures of him under the banner, the wrestling Jew. But Sam isn't dissuaded. He goes off to chase after her. So now it's like the Keystone Cops. So Sarah's parents go to Scotland to chase after them because they don't want this marriage to happen. They get there. They can't break them up. I mean, they're all the ripe old age, and I think at that time 19 and 21. She being 21, he being 19. And, they stay long enough to have some kind of a, grab a rabbi, quick wedding and get her pregnant. At which point, they couldn't leave her there knocked up. So they were going to have to go along with it. But he says to her, Sam says to Sarah, you stay here with your family. I'm going to go to the U.S., actually got a visa to Canada, lived in a basement where he shoveled coal for 2 years in Canada, then got to Detroit, I'm pretty sure illegally. Also important, these elements of this story, we talk about legal and illegal immigration. I'm even relatively conservative there, but let's be clear. The line between what's legal and illegal in the most successful American stories is a hell of a lot more gauzy than most people would like to appreciate. So he gets into Canada, gets into Detroit, he starts to make some money, and he sends, and he ultimately meets his wife and his by then 2-year-old daughter, right? In the interim, Sarah's older brother is begging their father and stepmother. Mom had died, he had remarried, by all accounts, everyone hated the second wife. I mean, it's hysterical. And they had 2 little kids, and he said, I don't care, you stay here. Do not go back to Minsk. I'm not only a wrestler. By the time this was happening, he owned a piece of a wool mill. He owned a piece of a lumber yard. He goes, I'm gonna be good. There's gonna be money here. I don't know about rich, but you will never want for anything. I will care for you. I will even care for my stepmother, who I hate in all honesty. I'll even care for my half-sisters, because that's not what this is about. We're just going to care for you. You cannot go back there. It's a horrible place. And in the end, his father assessed his son's life, assessed Scotland, and said, this is no place for a religious Jew. He packed up his wife and his next generation 2 kids, goes back to Minsk, and that part of my family disappears. And I don't know if they disappeared because of Stalin, or they disappeared because of pogroms, or they disappeared because of Nazi. I don't know. I just know they disappear. And one of the takeaways for me has always been that it's a funny twist when, in the defense of tradition, we end up ending the story, as opposed to finding a capacity to embrace what it feels like a disruption in the tradition, to actually continue the next chapters. And I'm not I don't blame them. No one could know who was right or wrong. I'm not saying I wouldn't have done the same thing. I'd like to think not, but who knows? But just to appreciate, especially when you come from a tradition that says, save 3 mitzvot, you break any rule to save a life. And because the kashrut wasn't up to his standards, his whole family vanishes. That's a funny notion of v'chai bahem, and you shall live according to them. And so, yeah, they end up coming, and by all means, do not live a particularly traditionally Jewish life. I mean, in that sense, all the rabbis who were saying to all these Eastern and Central European Jews, don't go to the New World because you'll give up Torah in the traditional sense, and don't go to Palestine, not a political statement, that's what it was, you'll be a communist. I mean, they were right. But they left out one thing. You would live. And we're the people that said, don't turn the tradition into an idol. And don't imagine there's any one practice, really short of rape, murder, incest, idolatry, that's worth your survival. And so they come to the States, and then my great-grandmother was horrified the first time she saw me at the age of 12 walk into her home wearing a kippah. I mean, she was disgusted. And she looked at me, and I bent down to kiss her, and she grabbed the back of my head. I mean, she had to be 93, 94. She lived past 100. And she tore my kippah off my head, bobby pins and all, and threw it on the ground. And she was, I did not come to America for that kind of silliness. And
Wow.
The fourth of her 6 kids, my grandmother, Sophie, looked at her mom and looked at me and went, because deep down my grandmother thought it was insane that she had a grandson walking around with a doily on his head. I mean, the whole thing was bizarre. And my mother, she was so traditionally observant, looked at her great-grandmother and, using one of the few words in Yiddish I ever heard growing up, said, "No, Bubby," that's the Yiddish word, says, "No, Bubby, you came to America so he could choose to if he wanted to." And so even there, the interdependence of free choice and genuine religious obligation, they're not separable categories, right? If the price of real obligation is coercion, it never ends well. And if freedom doesn't generate real obligation, it's its own kind of tyranny. It can take many generations to work that out. So that's the Scotland connection.
Wow. It's a wonderful, it's a powerful story. It's a painful story. And as you said, there's so many pieces to it that, we never know exactly where the choices will lead us. And yet within a context, we choose all the time. Right. We're making choices and imagining a future. But I'm really struck. The very last thing you said takes me back, I think, to the very first time I ever stepped into the offices at CLAL, the organization where you are president, this think tank that prides itself on bringing together people from across Jewish life, the whole Jewish spectrum. And as a student, still in rabbinical school, the very first exercise that we were asked to do together was to look at the different kind of denominational backgrounds that we came from. And not everyone even had a denominational label to choose, but, the primary ones were there. And to see if we could say and speak to something that we admired about a path that wasn't necessarily the one that we had chosen, and vice versa, to be able to see that. And there's so much, the whole of the trajectory of my rabbinate and the work that I've been able to do over the years with CLAL has really been guided by that, because I'm really struck how, that desire to live an observant traditional life, what that feels like when coercion of a negative kind, because there's some kinds of coercion which actually are, that there's some kind of positive coercions that are just about that sort of general good peer pressure that sort of helps make life a little less confusing when you don't have to choose everything.
Yes.
Right?
No, for sure. There, I would say that's the difference, and maybe a distinction without a difference, between being compelled and being coerced. To live a life where you don't feel compelled to do things, even though, forgive me, they're a pain in the ass, is not to live a mature life. But to feel that there is a taskmaster over us, other than a God we can choose or choose not to believe in, I just don't think it ever ends well. Now, if you don't experience being compelled internally, that's not that's not a grown-up life. It just isn't. And I don't care. It can be by a life partner, by a child, by a tradition, by a God. But to not have that experience of, yeah, this is kind of a pain, but that's the nature of being a mature human being. If you don't have that, you don't have a grown-up life. That's done by compelled. Coerced is someone outside you who really experiences not invested in you as much as you're invested in them, saying, you go do this. You have no choice. That would be the difference, and I think you're absolutely right. I want to be very clear. That is the difference, or one of the differences for me, between the pluralism to which CLAL is committed and relativism, which I think, and it's a strong statement, I think that the relativism that permeates much of contemporary life is every bit as toxic as the absolutism which permeates the other half of much of contemporary life. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That doesn't end well. I don't care who you are. I don't even care if it's going well for you that way now. And I'm willing to change my views, but someone would have to look at religion over the last couple thousand years. I'll just limit it to that, right? Rabbis, Christians, subsequent addition of Muslims. It's more or less the same time Buddhism is starting to flower, so we'll just go with the last couple thousand years. That kind of coercion never ends well. The flip side is a kind of relativism that's paralyzing, in which you can't say anything about anything to anyone, because who's to say? In the most extreme, and this is extreme, but I will stand by it, the absolutist becomes the murderer. The relativist is the one who stands by and does nothing about those being murdered. I reject both of those. The pluralist is the one who can say, look, I don't know 100% because I'm a human being. No one knows 100%. But I'll be damned if I'm not going to stake my life on this one. It's simply too important not to. How are they different from the absolutists? Because they started out by saying they're not 100% sure, which means they will revisit the question. How are they different from the relativist? Because they get in the game. They don't stand on the sideline wondering the rest of their lives.
Right. And knowing the difference, that walking that line.
Yeah, and you get it wrong. I've gotten it wrong on my own. I mean, my God, my whole life is about getting it wrong. The trick isn't can you get it right or get it wrong. The trick is, can you build in a mindset that leaves room for correctives? That's back to it's not about some golden mean. Find the straight and narrow and stay on it. If that were the case, then my life would be an abject failure. But if you can find as you veer into those places, and by the way, you can learn a lot from veering into those places, but is there a way to correct for it? Right? And for me, I mean, that exercise, we should give credit to the person from whom it was originally learned. Not only not a rabbi, but a Christian theologian, the former Lutheran Bishop of Stockholm and then professor at Harvard Divinity School, Christer Stendel of blessed memory. And his phrase for what you're describing was sacred envy. And by which he meant, now I pushed him in conversation, does that mean envy can be sacred? He said, that's an interesting claim. I said, so you think it's possible? He said, I didn't go that far. But he said, but what he meant by it was that as a convicted Lutheran, he could look at other churches and other religions and really be envious of things that they could do that he couldn't. It fell outside the purview of the canons of his faith or of his liturgy. But he could look across and say, that's remarkably beautiful. I'm not trading. I'm not becoming Catholic. I'm not becoming Jewish. But I'm not. But I can look over there and say that there is beauty to be found over there that I can't participate in, which is an incredibly brave posture. For me, theologically, Jewishly theologically, it's also the necessary outgrowth, if one believes, and we usually get it reversed, as I do, the Torah is the infinite gift of an infinite God. I really do believe in revelation that way. But that means that necessarily I believe the Torah in which I believe, because it is the infinite gift of an infinite God, can never be reduced to one finite reading. The moment, given what I believe, if I reduce Torah to a finite reading, I'd be saying I'm God. It's the ultimate idolatry. That kind of static reading of the tradition. By the way, if you really don't believe in God that way, then do enough history and philology and you can figure out what they meant and be done. But the moment you believe, whether this is a revealed text, once God, however you understand that, is in the picture, to my mind, one is necessarily obligated to a pluralist posture. Unless you actually think you're God, and then you need a therapist, not a rabbi or a priest.
Right, right. Whenever I'm engaging in conversation, it doesn't matter what the age of the person that I'm engaged in conversation with, and the God question comes up, what I normally will say when they say, is there a God? What do you believe about God? I say, truthfully, to me, the only really honest answer that one can give to that question on one level is, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the only honest answer. That doesn't mean that I'm not going to then share with you an idea of God that resonates with me.
That, to me, is the faith-driven posture. If you said, I know and I'll prove it to you, that's fine. I mean, neither of us believe that, but plenty of people do. I don't think it's so good for the world, but okay, that's a different conversation. But then don't call it faith. It's not faith. Right? It's knowledge, in the same way that, I know, as David Hume said, a rock is there because if I kick it, my toe hurts. That's not faith in the existence of the rock. That's knowledge of the rock. For me, God, or no God, because in that sense, given what we're saying, it doesn't make a difference, is an act of faith requires the humility to say two things. I don't know, and I'll stake my life on it. Anything less than having both of those, call it what you want, but please don't call it faith.
That approach, I think, opens a window or an understanding for me in conversations I've had in interfaith settings, which I know is something you've spent a great deal of time in interfaith settings, in conversations and in dialogues of all kinds. And it certainly is the landscape in which to put a lot of these beliefs and ideas and approaches to the test. And I'm actually very blessed. The organization that I'm part of in this part of Massachusetts now, that I helped to create, called Central Massachusetts Connections in Faith. It's the most diverse faith network that I've been part of in terms of the number of different faith groups represented. When we have an opportunity within a program to learn about one of those faith groups, we've done Islam and Hinduism, Judaism, different kinds of Christianity. More recently, we did the Baha'i faith, and our next program will be on the Church of Latter-day Saints, all with representatives, people who are part of our network who are wanting to share for them what's beautiful and special about their faith. And then the second half of the programs that we do are always people around the table of all different faith backgrounds. There's usually set questions, and we're getting to hear how we come at them, those, where we find those points of commonality and where there are those differences. But it's genuinely engaged conversation. And what I love about the people that I work with is that pretty much no one who comes to these programs comes going, oh, I heard wonderful things from everyone. I think I'm going to be an interfaith person. I'm just going to take a little bit of it all. I can love lots of the things that I hear, but I'm still deeply grounded in my Judaism, and somebody else is going to be deeply grounded in being a Baha'i or being part of the Church of Latter-day Saints. But there are others who, take it all in and say there's beauty to be found in all of it. Why do I have to choose? I kind of want to take it. Why can't I just have the bundle?
And I get it. My response is twofold. First of all, you can try, but there is no having it all because you're finite. So you can't embrace it all. It's not possible to embrace it all. No one can, right? And this may offend. Judaism can't embrace it all. Christianity can't embrace it all. And these are big traditions. Certainly individuals can't embrace it all because the all is bigger than us. That's number one. Number two, I have no problem with someone practicing what I call the interfaith, which is now a mid to late 20th and early 21st century American religion. But it is just that. It is a new tradition. And by all means, I think people do gain certain things when they create this faith salad. And I don't use that term in a derogatory way. I'm probably going to have a salad for dinner, and the more stuff in it, the better it will be. But eating a salad composed of lots of different things is a different experience than simply trying to appreciate, as we lifted our glass, it's not that all the whiskeys behind you aren't good in their way. But if you, and you could even pour them all together and come up with some concoction that you found pleasing. But then to say that, well, drinking this concoction is the same as appreciating each of them in their own integrity, that's just not true. And I think what happens is people get into that place because they're terrified to say, if they embrace theirs more deeply, that necessarily means they don't have deep regard and respect for the others. And for me, the work in those kinds of settings is not to figure out what we all share. That's easy. The trick is to find what we don't share and still figure out, can you still respect them?
Yeah.
Can there still be a place in your mind and your heart, knowing that you don't agree about everything? Go, you know, there's some wisdom there. It may not be what I can choose to live, but there's something there. And the fact is, if I jumped into that, I wouldn't be me. So I think a lot of this has to do, we've been trained to see things in zero-sum ways, and that forces us, because, you know, good people, we want to, quote, embrace it all, because we don't want to exclude or hurt. And I always tell people, the real ethical challenge is not who do you include. The real ethical challenge, since life always involves exclusions, is how do you think about and teach about and live beside those who you necessarily exclude? Because if it requires demonization or even disregard, that's too high a price to pay. That's why the work when there's difference has nothing to do with those who are different from us. It has to do with our own ethic of dealing with difference. And how do we make places for it? Not when we can embrace it. When we go, nope, not going to embrace it. But yes, that's part of the gift of an infinite presence in the world. I mean, the way I think of it is, there's an infinite well. We're all finite cups. I'm never going to hold 8 ounces in a 4-ounce cup. What I can do is be grateful to God that God made many 4-ounce cups. And in the aggregate, I can try and drink deeply in my 4 ounces and identify why it's good that those other cups are also full.
Brad, I think that's a beautiful place to start to draw to a close here. For those who have not had the privilege of hearing you, meeting you before, I hope that this will have provided a wonderful entree into who you are, how you teach, how you think about the world. For me, who has had the opportunity to study with you before and hope I will continue to in the future, it's a reminder to me of why I love these conversations, why I love the work and the thinking that goes on at CLAL and love to be part of it, because it just opens and broadens and also deepens all at the same time.
That's the work, and I'm grateful to you for this project, for the expertise you have in everything from whiskey to Torah, for the leadership I've seen you provide in multiple communities to an unbelievable range of people at a moment where we need exactly that kind of religious leadership. So I'm very grateful to you for the opportunity, and it's always good to talk with you and learn from you. So thank you.
Well, I'm going to pick my dram up again. I know yours is sitting there, talking about sweetness and breadth, but also enormous depth. I think that's a good way to describe Dalwhinnie as well. So,
Amen.
Brad, l'chaim.